Hi everyone, and thanks for visiting our web feature, What Everyone Should Know About Their State's Budget. We developed this feature because what state and local governments do is incredibly important to any parent who has kids in public school, to any businesses looking to hire community college graduates, and to taxpayers. They matter to those of us who commute on public roads or ride public transit, or who expect first responders to help keep us safe. But state and local budget debates often occur in a vacuum. People lack very basic information, not only about what their governments spend, but why. So the key insight that we're trying to share in this feature is that states start out in very different positions before governments even get around to negotiating budgets. States in the South and West tend to have a lot of school-age kids. Other states have a lot of low-income families. States in the Northeast have high labor costs. States like North Dakota and Montana have a lot of road miles to cover, even though they have fewer drivers living there. Other states have state parks or natural resources they have to maintain. So all of these factors affect how much state and local governments spend. On top of that, political leaders make policy choices about who is eligible for what services, often within federal rules, and individuals and families decide whether to enroll in public schools, ride public transit, or apply for Medicaid and other social programs. Using this tool, you can see which spending drivers matter for your state and how your state compares to other states. Where possible, we also report outcomes or what taxpayers get for the money. So first, a few points of clarification. Although we sometimes refer to states, all spending figures are for state and local governments combined. And we do this because states have different traditions of allocating spending responsibilities, so looking at just the state level could lead to mistaken inferences. California, for example, has much more centralized K-12 spending than other states do. So looking only at the state level would give you the impression that California spends more per capita than New Hampshire, when in fact the opposite is true for K-12 education. We also subtract user charges like tuition, fees, tolls, from spending on higher education, transportation, parks, and utilities. And we do this because we want to show the government subsidy to the activity in question, not what users are paying. But you can find gross spending data, including those user charges, as well as spending broken into current versus capital functions by clicking on our Data Depot button at the bottom of the page, which I'll show you in a second. The Data Depot includes all of the data underlying the tool, as well as supplemental tables on instructional K-12 employees or teachers versus non-teachers, as well as sworn versus non-sworn police officers, people who can make arrests versus those who can't, and then other education and experience groups for comparing public sector wages. There's also a documentation file at the bottom of the page that explains all of our sources. So I'll skip the intro because that's basically what I just covered and run through some examples. But first I want to give you some tips for navigating the tool. So the heart of the tool is these tables that rank states within major spending categories like K-12 education, higher education, or Medicaid. Some categories like public safety have multiple subcategories like corrections, police, and fire, and social programs include child care and TANF, or welfare. Tables include all states plus DC, which is often an outlier because it's more like a city than a state, and you can click on the circle appearing next to state names to make it easier to follow or compare them to other states. The columns in the tables show major spending drivers. So it shows who is potentially eligible for a program or service, who is actually eligible based on tough or flexible laws that the state has decided on, who takes up or uses the service, including for education, K-12 and higher education, attending any school, and then attending a public institution of higher education and K-12 education. And then for every category, we show the units of service provided, which is often staff per participant in the program, so teachers per student K-12 education, for example. But in things like transportation, we have road miles, given the amount of miles that are driven in the state. And then we have how much state and local governments spend on payroll versus everything else per employee. The X's and the plus signs at the top of the tables indicate that all of the columns actually sum and multiply to spending per capita, so you can always get back to that. And you can sort the tables by any of the columns. Scrolling over the column headers reveals an explanation of the information in that column, or why it is blank in some categories where the entire population is eligible, for example, as in parks. Colors in the table go from dark for the lowest values to light for the highest values, and scrolling over a cell reveals its numerical value. After you do a sort, little blocks of text or annotations pop up, providing more information or context for what you're seeing, and a rectangle to the left of the ranking table shows you where to find those annotations. Some annotations have charts that you can access by clicking this button that says View Chart. So now I'll run through a couple of examples. In Medicaid, we see a relationship that pops up in a lot of spending areas like K-12 education and higher education, which is that demographics is not always destiny. So places that have a lot of low-income people are not necessarily the ones that spend the most on Medicaid. Rather, the states that spend the most tend to be the ones that spend the most per recipient. So you can also sort that column. And the states that spend a lot per recipient tend to be the ones that have the most elderly and disabled beneficiaries compared to the national average. These beneficiaries tend to cost more to cover, and you can get information on that breakdown by going to our data depot or clicking on that link. We also looked at whether these states are paying providers more and didn't find that to be the case, and we provide that information also in our data depot. The states that spend the most on Medicaid also tend to have more generous eligibility rules. In K-12 education, we find that states that don't have very many kids, like New York and some of the New England states and DC, actually spend a lot on K-12 education, and some of these places also have a lot of kids who are in private as opposed to public schools. So the question is, why is that? Well, a lot of these states also have high payroll costs per employee and high other costs per employee. And sometimes, despite having these high costs, they also have a lot of employees, as in Connecticut, New Jersey, and New York. So then there are Western states that also have high payroll costs, like California, Nevada, and Washington, but they offset these high payroll costs by hiring fewer employees. Also, it's interesting to note that some of these payroll costs, although not all, are explained by labor market conditions. So to make that comparison, we look at what all employers in the state, public and private, pay for workers with a bachelor's degree or higher educational attainment. And in some places, the amount that's paid to school employees is about that amount. In some cases, it's more. In some cases, it's less. If you think that's not the right comparison group, then you can use other comparison groups with data in the data depot, which you can access down here, data depot. We also look at outcomes for some categories. So there's often assertion that having more employees is better for outcomes. We look at that ratio of staff to students in higher education and actually don't find a relationship with National Assessment of Educational Progress test scores for students once you adjust for demographics. So that's the tool. You can find, as I said, all of our sources in the documentation file. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the data. There's a lot more in our data depot. But we encourage you to explore these tables and try to uncover some other relationships, like the ones I haven't covered here, between, say, the generosity of social programs in terms of covering a lot of people versus providing richer benefits, keeping user fees low for public colleges and universities or highways as a way to promote access, but then perhaps providing fewer resources to the people who use those services. So give it a spin, and please let us know what you think. Thanks.